Now that we've seen the depth of field, I want to show you motion blur. As you've seen the fundamentals, and I've shown you in the previous lesson, we can control it through the shutter speed, which will determine whether we're gonna have more or less streaking. In camera settings, we can see right above the depth of field, motion blur. I'm gonna even turn the depth of field off, so we don't mix things up, okay? There are two things we can enable in motion blur, the camera and the geometry, or both. What does that mean? Let's say that you have a still scene, and your camera is moving, but you have only enabled geometry. In this case, it's gonna activate motion blur only for the objects that are moving. But as everything is standing still, except for your camera, you won't be able to see it. I will show you now what that means. I'm gonna animate the camera. I will set my camera here for frame 0. And for frame 10, I want my camera to be here. So, this is the movement the camera does, okay? Here in front. What should happen? There should be a movement streaking, because everything is moving, okay? I'm gonna render this frame here, for example. Frame 6. I'm gonna show you with the motion blur disabled. Nothing happens. Everything seems to be focused, because motion blur is not activated. And if I activate it with the geometry options enabled, I'll click start and nothing has changed as well. You must activate the camera motion blur because the objects are standing still. The same thing happens when your camera is still and the objects are moving, as I'm gonna show you now. I'm gonna select this teapot. I'm gonna set it to be here for frame 0. I want it to be here. And for frame 10, I want it to be over here. So it's moving as well, although it's moving with the camera, and that's not good. So I'm gonna do the opposite. I'm gonna place it here, and for frame 10, I want it to be here. There is a movement, you see? Cool. I'm gonna go back to frame 6. And now, I'm gonna render it. I will select the camera. As we've seen before, without the camera, there was no motion blur. But now we do have a moving object. Let's see what happens to the render. It generated motion blur. Check it out. We can see the movement of the second teapot, and not for the first one, because we have only activated motion blur for geometry, only for the moving objects, in this case, this teapot. If I turn off geometry and activate the camera only, we're gonna see motion blur because of the camera. We can even see motion blur on the second teapot, because the camera is also moving in relation to that object, but it's not adding camera and the object's motion blur together. So the ideal is for you to activate both to have a realistic effect. In real life, when you're filming, you have motion blur for both things. Motion blur is the difference in position between the first frame and the other frame of the things in motion. It doesn't matter if the camera and the objects are moving. That's why these both options must be enabled. You notice that the streaking of the second object is gonna be bigger. That happens because it added up motion blur, which is what happens in real life. Cool. Now we know what motion blur for the camera and the geometry is. And how do we control to have more or less light streaks? Do you remember we did that with the shutter speed? I'm just gonna open it again. That's what shutter speed does. The higher, the less blurry, the lower, the blurrier. Shutter speed is set to 50 here. If I render and increase it to 200, less light streak. If I decrease it to 24, much more light streak. So you have this control, which is one of the ways you can control it. I prefer to control motion blur by duration, because it's easier for me. But you can also do it by shutter speed. I've used shutter speed for a long time, because it's how the camera works. But controlling motion blur by duration is also good, because you can set it up to last for 1.25 frames. If I turn it on, it has a lot of light streaks. But if I set to 0.5, it's gonna decrease. This is one of the ways to do it. 0.2, it's gonna last for 0.2 frames. 0.5, 2 whole frames. It's gonna put 2 frames together. 1, it's gonna connect 1 frame to the other. What does all that mean? You probably have seen animation. When there is no motion blur, it looks like this. When moving, the camera actually does that. It's going from point A to point B. And 1 frame becomes so clear that it looks choppy. And you want it to be smooth. So when you select 1 for duration of the motion blur, it means that the motion blur will start for 1 whole frame until the next one, so that it will be very smooth. When you set for more than 1, it will be even smoother. That's why it was set to 1.25 before, so it makes your animation very smooth. If you set for less than 1 frame, if there is a little motion on your animation, no problem. But if there's a lot of movement, it risks being choppy as well. I always set the motion blur time to 1. We are talking here about animation, but obviously, if you just want to make a frame for a still, a car passing by or something like that, so you can adjust motion blur as you wish and consider to be closer to your reference. Don't forget about the reference. I'm telling you this because one big mistake you see in renderings is, for example, in a sunny day, very bright day, and the car with that long movement streak. That doesn't happen. Because if you decrease your shutter speed to the point to capture streaks that long, if you do that, just look what happens when using the photographic ISO. It's gonna be very bright, because the bigger the shutter, the darker it is. So, for us to see things on a bright sunny day, motion blur is very little. Got it? At night is the opposite. If I had little light, I will select the HDRI material that is lighting the scene and set it to -4. The scene will be dark. Let's see, -7 now. It's very dark. Now, I take the camera. I'm gonna decrease the shutter speed, because I want to see it. For a night scene, you should decrease shutter speed until it becomes clear. What happens then? You get very long streaks. So that's why, for night scenes, the cars can have a long lighting streaks, because your camera had to be opened and capturing light for a long period, thus allowing the car to go from point A to point B, and then it creates this effect. As for a day scene, If you let it open for so long, so much light will come in, and it's gonna be very, very bright. The shutter speed must be very fast, a fraction of a second, and little light will come in. And in a fraction of a second, the car moved just a little, and its motion blur is a little. Got it? I'm just telling you that so that you have reference. Because with reference, you're gonna see that in a night picture, you got a long streaking of a moving car. Or any object. Why do you think that when you take a selfie or any picture during the day, people are even moving and everything is clear? And at night, if you take a selfie, you must stand still. The camera will be capturing light for a longer period, and if you move a little, it becomes blurry. While as, if you stood still, holding your breath, you will be able to look sharp. You didn't move during the time the camera was opened, capturing the room light to be registered. Alright, now we know how motion blur works, so you can apply in your scenes. Did you like it? Let's move on.
Cenas, gostaram? Vamos lá, vamos continuar.